Welcome back, everybody. Today I'm going to be posting an update to my original Albedo video. I know I'd done a guide for her, but that was a little bit older and before a lot of people started to play her, especially towards the end of the season. Today, though, I'm going to be showing you the or I guess technically three most popular builds that I've seen for Albedo, which is kind of what we expected, but let's get into it. Let's talk about Albedo's stats. So as you can see here, she's got about 6.8k HP, 694 defense, both of which are fairly respectable for knights. However, as you can see from her S3, it is a full strip, in addition to an unbuffable and defense break. This is the skill that honestly feels like it gets used maybe the least outside of just cleaning up a few kills or just overwhelmingly nuking a cleaver. Outside of that, though, we have her skill 2, which I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with. Long story short, she throws out a big horse and it can only be activated once every 2 turns, but it hits like a truck depending on what build you're on, and it does also strip 1 buff, which can be kind of annoying depending on what characters you're playing. And then finally, you have her S1, which does a surprising amount of damage, in addition to also combat readiness pushing herself. The damage from her S1 is kind of like the equivalent to having a 3F, but it's a little bit higher. Long story short, it's a good S1. Let's move on. Okay, now let's talk about the game plan when it comes to playing Albedo. Now, of course, there are a couple different variations that you can play in terms of what kind of knight she'll be, whether she's mitigation, she's damage, she's anything in between. However, for the current styles of Albedo that I've been seeing, she is kind of picked quite frequently in the earlier kind of slots, although in this specific game she was picked later. And the strength specifically for picking her in this sort of phase, or picking her earlier as opposed to later, is that you don't really know what kind of Albedo you're fighting against. Are you fighting against one on protection set and immunity? Are you fighting against one that is on destruction and has, HP set and is trying to nuke you on S2? Is it on counter set? Who knows? The actual game plan, though, of this character, or the actual gameplay loop of this character, is pretty much standing still, getting hit by a horse, and long story short, bing bang boom, you've got a victory in most cases. Now, that isn't to say that there isn't any counter to Albedo, because of course, with every good new character comes development and adaptation to the character. However, I do think that in terms of how flexible she is as a knight, you can kind of almost equate how ridiculous it feels trying to figure out what you're fighting against, whether it's protection set or, if it's destruction or counter, similar to the experience that you have when you don't know if a character like Cannaaaa is on Rocket Punch or Noble Oath, or if an Abyssal Eufiend that gets picked earlier is on Elbrus or on Holy Sack. You're not really sure, and it does kind of change up your game plan a little bit, especially if you're playing Cleave, because it is so volatile and the matches are so scary. You might just end up fighting 4 big beefy knights. Who knows? Long story short, though, her game plan is to kind of sit pretty, one-shot when she can, and then use her S1 or S3 to clean up the team. Now, ultimately, her imprint concentration and her imprint release are both really nice. They're similar to Fallen Cecilia. There are some scenarios where you don't really need more health, or you don't really need more attack, more defense, etc. It kind of just accentuates what you already do better. It is worth noting that if you are trying to run the one-shot specific build on Albedo, where you run her on destruction and HP set, and you're trying to one-shot a character like Ludwig on the S2, it does actually kind of contribute a lot to your raw damage, and furthermore, if you are looking for not only more damage but also survivability, if you are running the destruction build, look no further than her imprint, which is definitely much more impactful compared. But think of any HP or attack scaler that doesn't have something like crit chance or effect resistance built in, where it really vitally matters for a specific win condition. In some cases, imprint concentrations are just additional fluff or additional padding that you don't need. But specifically, like I mentioned for Albedo, you do want a lot of the health, specifically because if you don't end up one-shotting the Ludwig and he's able to take a turn, it's just game over, lights out, GG for the cleaver. Now, for my own personal build, I've had a lot of struggles trying to build different variations of Albedos. I tried the destruction build, but my destruction build was not enough to actually one-shot the Ludwigs that I've been encountering. So therefore, what I've decided to land on, I don't have a plus 33F, is a protection set HP set. She is kind of just, again, a knight for me. I do like the fact that she has so much mitigation. She can also S3 and Death Break, and And kind of a nice thing of playing with Albedo is that if someone decides to pick, you know, someone like Ludwig, the Ludwig player does lose out on his attack buff, which then makes his consequent S2s or S3s much weaker. All in all though, although you don't necessarily need to have protection set, I do think that one of the more friendly builds if you're trying to play Albedo is this protection set, but keep in mind that with Albedo, and this will be something that I talk about later in the synergies and combos section, she doesn't or won't feel as good even if you're using this perfect protection set, HP set, Aureus build, if you don't have other characters to complement and fight against cleavers, as I'm sure most of you guys are doing right now. But moving along, as we talk about the best sets or the different variations of sets and combos that you can run on her, I think a lot of players at this point have accepted that if you are going to be running any variation of Albedo, it doesn't really matter if she hits, and she likely won't be the character that gets stunned first. So it is very good value actually to have HP set on her, whether you want to do more damage on S2, whether you want to tank more, give a bigger barrier with protection set, whatever it is. Her core 2-piece set is definitely going to be HP set, followed by anything like, I don't know, defense or broken or immunity or whatever gives you more HP. In terms of her 4-piece, you may be curious as to what kind of builds you can run on her. And ultimately, if you are running a Baby's First Albedo, running her on anything 6 broken sets is totally fine. Running her on speed plus HP is fine. But I think if you are trying to specialize a little bit and trying to find the best of the best when it comes to builds, something like Destruction and HP, like I mentioned before, to one-shot cleave teams is really nice if you want to run counter, so that if a cleaver decides to just endlessly S1 into your Albedo, they kind of get punished and they can get one shot off of the counter S1 into 3F proc. That is also really good. And then finally you have, again, the best in slot, I think, tanking kind of variation for knights right now, which is taking the role of Fallen Cecilia and power creeping it. In other words, running her with protection set so that everyone loads up with a barrier as soon as they start the game. That is probably going to be the best of the 3 sets, and anything else like maybe revenge or something could be funny, but this is what I feel, especially based on what I've seen right now in the climb for Legend and RTA. Now, in terms of her artifact, this is pretty quick and easy. If you are running her on the mitigation variation, you definitely want to run her on Aureus because you want to provide more protection for the team. But outside of that, if you do want to do more damage, 3F is really good because it does a whole lot, especially with your S1 and your S3, you know, hitting a squishy target. I do think that in most cases you overkill even without 3F, but in most variations that you are trying to one-shot Ludwig, or if you are trying to kind of punish aggro players, you do want a little bit more of the damage. So in that case, 3F is really good. If you don't have her artifact by some magic act of God and you haven't decided to get it from Powder Shop or anything like that, which is already kind of crazy, you could run something like Mature Sunglasses, or I don't know, maybe even Broken Will the Priest. I don't really recommend this though, again, because it doesn't feel as good as the additional pop. As a final parting note on the artifact, should you really have none of these things, running something like Proof of Valor is also fine, but Aureus is a 4-star and a lot of people have Aureus right now, so if you do have a free Aureus, I would definitely recommend placing it on the Albedo and see how much you can win with it, because honestly, even replacing a character like Carmen, it does feel a little bit better when you're fighting against cleavers, especially when you can strip off something like, I don't know, an attack buff. Now, you're probably wondering whether or not Albedo has any uses in something like PvE or PvP. And for PvE, let me be frank. Outside of the current farming event that you may be doing for the first half, technically, where you can farm with Albedo and Ainz, she has not many practical uses. Of course, she is a mitigation knight, and she does boast having a full strip, unbuffable, and death break. And on my alt account, I was able to clear through and do all the Aiden missions while having my Albedo kind of just on 6 HP set. So in that sense, she's okay, but you could argue that literally any knight in the game could do that, although she does, again, kind of offer some utility with having a defense break and also having the strip on S2. That being said, outside of that, I haven't seen too many teams, but I'm also not that big of a chef for PvE labyrinth teams like that, so feel free to let me know what you find. For PvP, however, I will kind of just go down and show you just how impactful or how relevant she feels, especially in RTA. If I just look down through my matches, I don't see any here. Look, that's 1. Okay, that's 2. Okay, that's 3. Okay, that's 4. Okay, Okay, that's 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. That is 11 Albedo games in my last, I think it's like the last 20 matches or 30 matches, something like that. Absolutely ridiculous. She has a really, really insanely high impact kind of on the RTA scene at the very minimum, in my opinion. And in that sense, I think that at the very minimum, you have to say that she is kind of nice, especially fighting against Cleve. And of course, I'm playing Cleve, so I'm going to see her more often than not. But I'm sure from your guys' experience as well, you see Cleve all the time. You might see ML Poly Cannaaaa. She could be someone that's kind of decent. So keep that in mind when you are trying to build her for PvP. I do think that in certain situations, you can also bait characters into Albedo, especially if they're fire, if you are running her in the mitigation. And otherwise, again, she's a knight. She does kind of have a decent amount of, you know, mitigation and built-in kind of tankiness. So if you want to run that into something like Guild War, by all means, feel free to. I've also seen a variation that has high effectiveness to def break Dark Corvuses and things like that. So keep that in mind when you're trying to build different variations and what you're doing with her on Guild War, Arena, etc, etc. Now, if we talk about synergies and counters for a moment, of course, the kind of elephant in the room is that if you don't have the ability to counter, or if you do fight against characters that counter or prevent counters, like a character like Judge Kisei or Ashamancer Elena, it does feel like this Albedo character suffers just a tiny little bit. Characters like Pavel also get to proc her a little bit earlier, which makes her, again, a lot more susceptible to, again, more anti-counter units. I think that's how you would phrase it. That being said, though, I do think one of the strongest drafts that I've seen right now that involve her, especially if you're fighting against cleavers, involves kind of stacking up a bunch of knights. I've seen a few games at this point where they literally just end up running something like 5 total knights. And they kind of just pray that I end up falling over and dying because I don't have enough DPS to pen through it. And in that sense, I do think that her synergies definitely lie in having more pivotable characters, characters that aren't telling of what you're trying to do and let you pivot out. In that case, characters like Laya, maybe Karina, that can maybe result in like a 4 or 5 pivot in RTA feels kind of really nice. But again, if you do want to pair the Albedo alongside characters that just can't get hit, aka with characters like Spectre Tenebria or any Guiding Light, that also feels fine, especially since, again, she can also boast having a protection set. Now, I mentioned earlier that she does kind of lose to anti-counter kind of team compositions, whether that's Judge Kisei or something to that extent. But just also keep in mind that if you are running a character like Moonlight Politis and Cannaaaa, she gets kind of sliced through like butter because she is really, really susceptible, not only because of Cannaa's full defense pen, but also because of the element disadvantage. A character like Ambitious Tywin, especially when you pair him with Rage, also does give you the ability to defense break the entire team and stun at the exact same time, which is really nice. But I do think that Albedo in her current variation is kind of really flexible, so I would definitely say that although she has weaknesses, they don't feel as pronounced, especially at the higher end, where gearing and actually being able to play a good Albedo is not so much the issue as opposed to an issue like she functionally in kit is not good enough to play. Okay, and now you're probably wondering whether I think that Albedo is worth pulling for, but before anything else, just remember that if she's your waifu, if you really like her, of course, pull for who you like. That being said, she is a collab character and we aren't sure when she's going to come back. So I would definitely just based off of that merit also pull for her. But even if you want to take a look at least for an Emperor's kind of point of view, or if you're striving to be Emperor, not quite that legend level where like maybe the gear is just absolutely ridiculous, but even for Emperor, she does boast a surprisingly high win rate right now. It is a 53.25%, and that's for a character that's only had about a week or two of labbing or trying to research her. Long story short, though, I think that her win rate, the amount of play that I've been seeing on her, and just the kind of volatility of her playstyle and the different playstyles you can play with her, kind of lands her at a must pull for me. And honestly, if you don't pull her because you don't like her, I don't know. She's really cute in the anime. Go ahead, pull her for that reason. She's pretty waifu. And now finally, guys, at the end of this kind of guide, showcase, whatever you want to call it, I do think that Albedo is pretty strong. I think, like I said, she's likely a must pull for most players just because you don't really have to have the most insane gear to use her as a mitigation knight, and especially if you aren't someone that already has a character like Crimson Armin, it does feel like she's quite strong. That being said, I do think that if you are looking for an exciting character, she doesn't really feel like it right now. Even if they end up buffing her in a kind of meaningful way for her to be good, I think that just the nature of her being a knight and her kind of needing to have super insane gear score for you to really make use of her as a DPS does make her look a little bit ridiculous. Now again, if you aren't super perfectly tuned on your DPS, you'll probably live any non-perfect Albedo S2. And then furthermore, I think that in terms of her tanking capability, she's already kind of doing that well. The only thing I would say is that, again, if you are a little bit clever about it, you can beat her if you're just kind of fighting against a knight, because all slower player compositions right now do kind of have answers. But at the end of it all, I do think that if they do want to buff her, if they do want to change her, keep in mind that any real functional change to her kit that makes it more meaningfully annoying in a DPS sort of sense will kind of push her over the edge, and you'll start to do things like one-shot characters that you had no business one-shotting with your S2. And my cleave team is already getting one-shot. Surely we don't need to do this anymore, Smallgate. Surely, yeah? Okay. If you want to give her more HP or give her, like, I don't know, an HP buff, something like that, by all means, feel free to do so, so that people can build her as a knight a little bit easier. But I think, honestly, the symptom or the problem with Albedo is not so much Albedo anymore. It feels like the problem is that there aren't great characters for free-to-play or newer RTA players to pair with her, so it makes it worth it for you to take a character like Albedo on your team. Anyways, guys, that's going to be it for this video. Thank you again for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Hope you learned something. If you did, make sure to like, comment, turn on the notification bell, and subscribe. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you on the next one. My subathon skill is still going on. I don't know. We're on day 8. Anyways, see you guys on the subathon. Make sure to check out the rest of my socials. I'll see you all next time. Love you guys.